The rain was the kind that gets right into your bones. It wasn't a gentle shower, it was a cold, relentless downpour that had started hours ago, and showed no sign of letting up. I stood there on the driveway, the gravel digging into my knees. Because it'd fallen when they pushed me out, the water was already pooling around me, soaking through my jeans, my shirt. Everything. I could see the warm golden light from the house windows. I could hear the music faintly, and sometimes a burst of laughter would cut through the drumming of that house. Id painted the shutters on that house. Id helped plant the garden in the back for 10 years. Id worked for them not just as an employee, but as someone who cared. I fixed things before they broke. I remembered birthdays. When Mr. Croft was sick, I was the one who drove him to his appointments. I thought we were a kind of family, a strange, unequal one maybe, but a family nonetheless. The next week was a blur of quiet desperation. I crashed on a friend's couch, the same friend who'd warned me years ago about trusting the Crofts. I was too proud to call my family. I spent my days in the public library. Using their computers, the anger hadn't faded, it had crystallized into a cold, focused determination. I wasn't interested in a messy emotional fight. I wanted something clean, I wanted something legal, I wanted to beat them at their own game. It was out for delivery. Sir, the weather's been causing delays all week. I shifted my weight, the cold starting to seep through my shoes. The rain was coming down even harder, now a solid gray curtain. I am sorry, but would it be possible to wait here on your porch for just a few minutes, just until this worst part passes? My next stop is just a few blocks over. He looked at me as if I'd asked to borrow his car. He looked past me at my van parked at the curb, and then back at my drenched uniform. Carol stepped forward, a tight, insincere smile on her face. "I'm afraid that's not possible," she said, her voice sweet but firm. "We're expecting guests. It would be inconvenient." "Inconvenient?" Mr. Henderson echoed, as if the word itself justified everything. "You should have checked the forecast." I just stood there for a second, the reality of the situation sinking in. They weren't just saying no, they were looking at me like I was a nuisance, an inconvenience that had to be removed from their pristine porch. The warmth from their house spilled out, and I could smell something cooking, something warm and savory. It felt like a cruel tease. "Okay," I said quietly, my voice almost lost in the sound of the rain. "I understand." I turned and walked back down the driveway. There was no point in running now. The rain was icy, and it soaked through my clothes in seconds. I felt a hot flush of humiliation mix with the cold. It wasn't just about the rain. It was the casual way they dismissed me, like I wasn't worth a moment of their comfort. I got back in my van shivering, and sat there for a minute, wiping the water from my face. The windows fogged up immediately. I could still see the outline of their house, a fortress of warmth and indifference. My next delivery was for a small, older bungalow just around the corner. The porch light was on a weak yellow glow in the gloomy afternoon. An elderly man named Mr. Gable was on my list. I'd delivered to him a few times. Before, he was always quiet but polite. I grabbed his Packagia bag of medication from the pharmacy and made a run for it. When I got to his door, I saw him through the screen, struggling to get up from his armchair. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. "It's all right, Mr. Gable," I called out. "It's just the delivery. I'll leave it right here for you." He waved a frail hand. No, coming out of that rain, for heaven's sake, you're drenched." I started digging. I read every piece of public record I could find about their company, about their personal holdings. I looked at property deeds, business registrations. Everything. It felt hopeless. They were careful, savvy businessmen. They had lawyers who made sure every I was dotted, every T was crossed. I was looking for a ghost, a mistake they would never make. He didn't just say it, he meant it. There was a genuine concern in his voice that I hadn't heard all day. I hesitated, not wanting to track water into his home, but he insisted. "I have an old towel by the door, please." So I stepped inside. His house was small and cluttered, but it was warm and smelled of tea and old books. It was the complete opposite of the Hendersons' cold grandeur. He shuffled to the kitchen and came back with a glass of water. "You look like you could use this," he said. His hands trembled slightly. "Thank you, sir. I just have to get this signed for you." I handed him the electronic pad. While he carefully signed his name, I noticed his fireplace was stacked with logs, but unlit. The room was a little chilly. "You know," I said, "I could get that fire going for you before I go. It would warm the place up nicely." He looked surprised, then grateful. "Would you? My arthritis. It makes it difficult to bend down and fiddle with the kindling." It took me less than 5 minutes. I cleared the old ashes, laid new paper and wood, and got a nice little flame going. The immediate warmth was rewarding. He watched me from his chair, a soft smile on his face. "You're a kind young man," he said. "Most people are in too much of a hurry." "It's no trouble at all." I noticed his mailbox by the door was overflowing. "Would you like me to bring your mail in? It's looking pretty full." "If you wouldn't mind," he said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "The walk to the curb has become a bit of a challenge." I brought in a stack of letters and placed them on the table next to him. We talked for a few more minutes. He told me he had been a history teacher. He lived alone. Since his wife passed a few years back, his children lived far away. It was a long conversation. But it was a real one. I wasn't a delivery driver in that moment. I was just a person talking to another person. When I left, the rain had lightened to a mist. I felt warmer. And it wasn't just from the fire. I didn't think much more about it. That was just a Tuesday. I continued my route, delivered the rest of my packages. The memory of the Hendersons' rejection was pushed aside by the simple decency of Mr. Gable. Then I remembered something. Years ago, when I first started, the company was just a tiny startup, operating out of David's garage. We needed a small loan to buy our first real server. The banks wouldn't touch us. In desperation, David had gotten a private loan from a reclusive uncle of his. A man none of us had ever met. The uncle was old-fashioned. He insisted on a hard collateral agreement. I was there when David signed the papers. He joked about it, saying his uncle was paranoid. The collateral. Weeks passed. Then one morning, I received a letter from a law firm, Davidson Shaw. I almost threw it away, thinking it was spam. But something made me open it. It was formal, requesting my presence at their offices, regarding the estate of Arthur Gable. My heart sank. Arthur Gable, Mr. Gable. I went to the meeting with a heavy feeling. I thought maybe he had left me a small token in his, well, a few $100s, maybe a book, as a thank you for the small favors. The lawyer, a serious-faced woman named Ms. Reed, greeted me politely and offered me a seat. "Thank you for coming," she said, opening a file. "As you know, Mr. Gable passed away peacefully last week." I nodded, feeling a genuine pang of sadness for the quiet, kind old man. "I am the executor of his will. He was a client of mine for many years, and he updated his will quite recently." She slid a document across the table. "Mr. Gable had no immediate family. He wished to inherit his estate. His children are financially secure, and he was estranged from them for some time. He was a man of simple means, but he did own his home outright." I listened, still not understanding. "He spoke very highly of you," Ms. Reed continued, a faint smile touching her lips. "He mentioned your kindness on several occasions, how you didn't just deliver packages, you took a moment to be a human being. He specifically noted the day you built him a fire and brought in his mail. He said it was the first time in a long time he hadn't felt invisible." She pointed to a clause in the document to that end. "He has bequeathed his entire estate, which consists primarily of the property and its contents, to you." The words didn't register at first. They hung in the air, meaningless to me. "The house?" "Yes," she said, "the property on Crestview Lane." Crestview Lane, the name echoed in my mind. That was the Henderson Street. A cold realization began to dawn on me. "What number?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Was this very house, the one I'd been thrown out of it, was the only asset David had that was worth anything at the time? "Number 42, she said. "Number 42, that wasn't Mr. Gable's bungalow. His was number 38. Number 42 was the big house, the Hendersons' house." My mind raced. It didn't make sense. "I think there's a mistake," I stammered. "Mr. Gable lived at number 38, the small house next door." Ms. Reed shook her head patiently. "No, that's a common misconception. The land was originally one large parcel. The main house, number 42, was built first. The smaller house at number 38 was built later as a guest house. Mr. Gable owned both properties. The Hendersons were his tenants." The world tilted. Tenants. They didn't own that house. They rented it from the quiet old man next door, whom they probably never even acknowledged. The cruelty of it, all the sheer perfect irony, left me breathless. "The legal process," she explained, "was already complete. As the sole beneficiary, the transfer of ownership was immediate. The tenants, the Hendersons, had been notified that morning that the property had a new owner, and that their month-to-month lease was terminated." I drove to Crestview Lane. The next day the sun was out drying the puddles from a morning shower. I parked in the same spot. But this time I didn't have a package. I had a set of keys given to me by the lawyer. I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding not with anger, but with a profound, quiet sense of awe. As I reached the porch, the front door opened. Carol Henderson stood there, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her husband was behind her on the phone, his voice loud and frantic. "There has to be a mistake. We've lived here for 5 years. You can't just evict us like this." Then he saw me. He stopped talking. The silence was thick and heavy. Carol's eyes widened as I took the keys from my pocket. The recognition was slow, then horrifyingly complete. "You, Mr. Henderson," stammered, lowering the phone. "What are you doing here?" I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at the house, my house, and then back at them. There was no gloating in me, no desire for revenge. I felt a strange pity for them. Their world, built on such a fragile foundation of assumed superiority, had just collapsed. The loan was for a pittance compared to what the company was worth now, maybe $50,000. I'd completely forgotten about it. We paid the uncle back within a year, or at least I thought we had. The paperwork was always messy back then. David handled it. I never saw a receipt. "I am the new owner," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I've come to see the property." The color drained from their faces. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, scrambling fear. They started talking at once: apologies, excuses, offers. They said they hadn't known who I was. They said the rain had put them in a bad mood. It was a torrent of words meant to save them. But it was too late. The karma wasn't in my hands. It was in the simple, unchangeable fact of the situation. I listened until they ran out of things to say. The silence returned, more powerful than their pleas. I looked past them into the foyer. I had been refused entry to just weeks before I thought about Mr. Gable, sitting in his small, warm house, seeing more in a 5-minute interaction than these people had seen in their entire lives. I didn't need to say anything else. The truth was written in their stunned, helpless expressions. A single act of casual cruelty and a separate act of simple kindness had become intertwined by a thread of fate I never could have imagined. I walked past them into the house and closed the door on their old life. The lesson wasn't about getting even. It was about how the universe sometimes balances the scales in the most unexpected, humbling way, rewarding decency, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, profound justice. They dismissed me. They actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that was meant to cut. The rain was coming down in sheets, a cold, relentless downpour that soaked through my coat in seconds. I had come to that house, Blackwood Manor, with such hope. My research pointed to it being a possible site of immense historical significance, a missing piece of a puzzle I'd been working on for years. The current owners, the Hargraves, had agreed to a meeting, but the moment I mentioned my interest in the property's foundation, the original deeds, their hospitality vanished. Mr. Hargrave, a man with a face like a closed fist, accused me of being a treasure hunter, a fraud. He said I was wasting their time, and then he ushered me out, not even bothering with an umbrella, and I heard the heavy oak door lock firmly behind me. The insult was one thing, a professional sting, but the rain, the sheer physical misery of it, that was something else. I huddled under the scant protection of a massive ancient oak tree at the edge of the grand lawn, my notes turning to pulp in my bag. Lightning flashed, illuminating the stark, arrogant lines of the house. And in that brief, brilliant moment, I saw it near the base of the tree, where the rain had carved a small gully in the soil. Something glinted, a metallic edge peeking out from the mud. I dropped to my knees, my professional pride forgot, my fingers clawing at the wet earth. It was a metal box, small and surprisingly heavy, crusted with rust, but still intact. The lock had long since corroded away, sitting there shivering under that tree. I pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly held up against the decades, was a bundle of papers. The ink was faded in places, but the script was still legible, a letter, and what looked like a property deed. The date on the letter made my heart stop. 1872. It was addressed to a woman named Eleanor Vance, my great-great-grandmother, and it spoke of a betrayal, of a loan never repaid, of a deed signed under duress. It mentioned a clause, a right of redemption, that the family had been cheated out of. This wasn't just a historical curiosity, this was evidence. A frantic search through old corporate filings led me to a scanned copy of the original loan agreement. It was all there, the terms, the interest, the description of the property as collateral. Then I searched the county clerk's records. I searched for a lien release for any document showing the debt had been satisfied. There was nothing. The lien, the claim against the house, was still active. It had never been formally discharged. I didn't go home. I went straight to the city archives, a place that was more familiar to me than my own apartment. The night guard knew me by name. I signed in my wet clothes, leaving a small puddle on the polished floor. And I carried my precious mud-stained box to my usual carol. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. This was my element. This was where ghosts spoke through faded ink and brittle paper. I laid out the contents of the box. With the care of a surgeon, the letter from Eleanor Vance was a cry of despair, a detailed account of how Josiah Blackwood, the man who built the manor, had claimed the land after her husband Thomas died unexpectedly. He produced a loan document, with a usurious interest, rated document. Thomas had never mentioned. He threatened her, leveraging a family secret to force her to sign over the deed. But she was clever. She wrote that she had inserted a specific clause, a right of reclamation for her direct descendants, should they be able to prove the fraudulent nature of the original transaction. She hid this letter and a copy of the true original deed, hoping one day someone would find it. The all-night session began. I pulled land registry records from the 1860s and 70s. I cross-referenced census, date of birth certificates, death certificates. I found the record of Thomas Vance's death, officially listed as accidental. I found the transfer of the property to Josiah Blackwood, the paperwork slick and official-looking. But when I compared the signature to Thomas Vance's, will filed just a year earlier, the difference was obvious, a forgery. I traced the Hargrave family tree. They weren't descendants of Blackwood. They were interlopers who bought the property in the 1950s, likely unaware of the blood and deceit its foundations were built on. Or were they? The speed with which they ejected me suggested a deep-seated defensiveness. Maybe they knew a skeleton was in the closet. They just didn't know I was the one who could give it a voice. By 4 a.m., I had a timeline, a narrative. It was all there, a story of greed and loss waiting for over a century to be told. The legal case wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. The right of redemption clause Eleanor wrote about was in fact a recognized, if archaic, part of property law in our state, never formally abolished for claims predating a certain statute. The forged signature was undeniable. I had the evidence of the fraud from the victim's own hand. This wasn't a civil dispute, it was the correction of a historical crime. As the sun began to tinge the horizon pink, I made a call. I called Arthur Finch, a lawyer I'd consulted on other historical property disputes. I woke him up, but the moment I started explaining what I had, his sleepiness vanished. He met me at the archives an hour later, his tie crooked, but his mind razor-sharp. He scanned the documents, his eyes widening. He said he'd never seen a case so clear-cut, with evidence so pristine from that era, because the property was currently occupied. And there was a risk of evidence tampering. He said we could go for an emergency injunction. We drafted the filing right there. He knew a judge, an old-fashioned jurist with a passion for history and justice, who would be at his chambers. Early, we filed the motion at 7:00 a.m. By 8:30, we had a ruling. The injunction was granted due to the unique and compelling circumstances. The court recognized my immediate claim. Possession of Blackwood Manor was awarded to me, Eleanor Vance's direct descendant. Pending a full hearing, that was now a mere formality. My heart started pounding a different kind of rhythm from the despair of the previous week. This was a pulse of pure, undiluted possibility. I dug deeper. The terms of the loan were brutal, written by a man who didn't trust anyone. It stated that if the loan was not paid in full by the maturity date, the entire principal and accrued interest would become immediately due. And if it wasn't paid, the title to the property would transfer directly to the lender. No court order needed. It was a right of. I didn't change my clothes. I went back to the house in the same rain-dampened suit from the day before, but I was not the same person. Arthur Finch accompanied me, along with a court officer. The Hargraves were having breakfast in their sunroom. The look on their faces when they saw me was not just surprise, it was fear. They knew, maybe not the specifics, but they knew the house had a tainted past. Mr. Hargrave blustered, threatened to call his lawyers, but Arthur calmly presented the court order. He explained the situation in cold legal terms: the forged deed, the fraud committed by Josiah Blackwood, the unextinguished right of reclamation belonging to the Vance line, the historical crime, the Hargraves' ownership was invalid, the house, the land, everything belonged to me. The color drained from their faces. The shame wasn't just about losing their home, It was about the revelation they had lived in a monument to theft their wealth. Their status was built on a lie they had perhaps willingly ignored. They were given 1 hour to pack their personal effects. They moved like ghosts, the illusion of their lives completely shattered. When they were gone, and the court officer sealed the door, I was finally alone. I walked through the silent, empty halls. This wasn't a victory of property law. This was a restoration. I ran my hand along the mahogany banister, my ancestors' banister. I stood in the main hall and looked out the window toward the old oak tree. Eleanor Vance had looked out this same window, heartbroken. I had not just won a house. I had answered a plea sent through time. I had reclaimed a legacy that was stolen. The rain had washed away the dirt to reveal the truth, and the law had delivered the justice that was a century and a half overdue. This was no longer Blackwood Manor, it was Vance House, and I was finally home. The rain was cold, a proper soaking London rain that found its way through the collar of my coat and dripped down my neck. I stood there on the pavement, water pooling around my shoes, just staring at the sleek black facade of the building, our building. At least it was ours. Until about 20 minutes ago, the lights were on in the boardroom on the 3rd floor. I could see their shadows moving against the blinds, celebrating. It was supposed to be the final meeting, the culmination of 2 years of work. The Sterling Fund was our baby, mine and Julian's. We built it from a concept scribbled on a napkin into a vehicle managing over £200 million. I found the investors, I structured the initial deals. But Julian, he had the old money, contacts, the smooth charm that opened doors in clubs it'd never be allowed into. And David, our third partner, brought the legal architecture. We were a perfect triangle, or so I thought. The call came as I was hailing a cab to come to the meeting. David's voice clipped and sterile. Don't bother, Alex. The vote's already been taken. The partnership agreement has been amended. Your interests have been consolidated. Consolidated, id, repeated the word, feeling alien. Foreclosure writ, in the most absolute terms I had ever seen. Bought out for £1. It was legally sound. The clauses were there, you just never read them closely enough. I could hear the faint sound of champagne glasses clinking in the background. Julian's laughter, loud and booming, echoed down the line. Then David said, it's nothing personal, just business. You were always a bit too emotional about the numbers, too cautious. We need to be aggressive now. Then the line went dead. Emotional, cautious. They were words they'd used before, always with a patronizing smile. They thought my meticulousness was a weakness. They saw my insistence on understanding every variable, every hidden risk, as a lack of nerve. They wanted to chase the hot, flashy deals, the leveraged buyouts with debt piled on debt. I was the anchor, the one who checked the charts before sailing into a storm. And tonight they'd cut the anchor loose. I finally turned away from the building and started walking. The rain didn't matter anymore. The cold was just a sensation. My mind was already detaching, shifting gears. The shock and the hurt were real, a sharp physical pain in my chest. But they were being pushed aside by something colder, something far more calculating. They thought they'd been clever. They'd used a combination of clauses, a forced sale provision, triggered by a majority vote, coupled with a preemptive rights agreement that they'd structured to favor themselves. They'd boxed me out legally. They owned the company, the fund, everything. But they'd made 2 catastrophic mistakes. The first was believing that the company and the fund were the only assets that mattered. The second was underestimating what I did in the quiet hours, the deep dive research I conducted, not just on our investments, but on them, on Julian. You see, while Julian was charming investors, I was building a different kind of map. I knew things. I knew about his secret passion, his true vanity project, that had nothing to do with the fund. It was a property development company he'd set up separately using his own name, leveraged to the hilt. He'd poured millions into a portfolio of high-end residential properties, including a colossal modernist house in Hampstead Heath that was his pride and joy. He'd even shown me the plans, once bragging about how it was his legacy asset to fund it. He hadn't used standard bank loans. He'd gotten creative, using a complex web of short-term high-interest bonds issued by a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It was aggressive, highly risky, and he'd kept it completely separate from the fund. Or so he thought, but the shell company's debt was publicly traded, a ticking bomb on the markets. Their plan was to use the Sterling Fund to pump up the value of their own personal ventures. They'd locked me out to remove the last obstacle, but in doing so, they'd handed me the detonator. I didn't go home, I went to my private office, a small, secure room above a bookshop in Bloomsbury that nobody knew about, no AI assistants, no cloud storage, just a dedicated terminal with a direct encrypted line to a trading floor in Singapore. The sun was coming up over there as London slept. I started moving first. I liquidated everything, my personal portfolio, the trusts, even the antique watch collection my grandfather left me. I converted it all into cash. It was a fortune. But it wouldn't be enough on its own. This was about leverage. I placed calls not to friends. This wasn't about friendship but to contacts, men and women, who moved in the shadows of finance, who understood risk and reward in its purest form. I presented them with a proposition, not a plea, a mathematical. The maturity date had passed over 8. Certainty wrapped in a tight time frame. I showed them the structure of Julian's debt. The bonds were trading at a slight discount because of their complexity, but they were due for a massive coupon payment in 72 hours. A payment I knew his development company couldn't make without a cash injection from the Sterling Fund, an injection that now I was gone would be approved without a second thought. But they wouldn't get the chance. I initiated a massive short position against those bonds. Essentially, I was betting that their value would plummet, then using every pound of my own capital. And the capital I'd borrowed, I started buying not the bonds themselves. Not yet. I bought the credit default swaps on them. It's an insurance policy. If the bonds default, the seller of the swap has to pay out the face value. The cost of these swaps was low, because everyone thought the bonds were solid, backed by Julian's reputation. I bought every single one I could find, draining the market of liquidity. I was creating a vacuum. And I executed the final move. I placed a sell order, a massive, overwhelming sell order for the bonds themselves, far below their market price. It was a cannonball into a placid pond. The algorithms went wild. Other automated traders, seeing the sudden violent drop, started panic selling. The price of Julian's bonds collapsed in a matter of minutes. The cascade was beautiful, a symphony of pure logic. The drop in bond prices triggered clauses in the swap agreements demanding immediate collateral from the institutions that had sold them. Those institutions, facing massive instantaneous losses, had to dump other assets to raise cash, creating a feedback loop that rippled through related markets. By the time the City of London woke up, Julian's development company was technically insolvent. The value of its debt had been eviscerated. The bonds were now junk. And I held the insurance policies that were paying out exponentially, the very mechanisms they thought made them smart, the leverage. And the complexity had become a noose. My phone started buzzing. First it was David, his voice a frantic screech. I didn't answer, then Julian, call after call. I let them go to voicemail. I was too busy. Because when a company defaults on its debt, the debt doesn't just disappear, it gets sold for pennies on the pound. And with the capital from my credit default swap payouts, I was now the only buyer with both the will and the cash to purchase that entire stack of debt. I bought it all, every single bond, through a series of anonymous trusts. I became Julian's sole creditor, not just a creditor, but the owner of obligations his company could never hope to repay. The sun was properly up over London. Now the rain had stopped, and the streets were steaming. I felt no excitement, no glee. It was just a process that had reached its conclusion. I took a cab to Hampstead Heath. The house was even more imposing in person, all glass and sharp angles, perched on a hill like a predator. I had the documents in a simple leather portfolio. They were waiting for me on the driveway. Julian, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. David stood slightly behind him, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The front door was open, and I could see a woman's coat draped over a chair inside. Julian's wife. She must have been watching from a window. The company had paid the uncle, I was sure of it, but David, in his haste to move on to bigger things, had never filed the paperwork to release the lien. It was a bureaucratic oversight, a tiny forgotten thread, and I was holding the end of it. Alex, what is this? Julian spat, his voice trembling. What have you done? I didn't smile, I didn't frown, I just opened the portfolio. It's quite simple, Julian. Your company, Heathview Developments, has defaulted on its senior secured notes. All of them. I have acquired the debt. The covenants are very clear. In the event of a cross default, which has now occurred, the collateral is forfeit to the noteholder. I handed him the top sheet, a list of assets. The final item was this property his house used as the primary security. He stared at the paper, his hands shaking so violently The pages rattled. You can't do this, this is my home. It was I said, my voice calm level, the voice of a banker finalizing a transaction. It's now an asset of the debt recovery vehicle. You have 48 hours to vacate the locks. Will be changed at noon on Wednesday. David finally found his voice. Well, fight. This, Alex. Will take you to every court in the country. This is theft. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time that morning. It's not theft, David, it's leverage. You taught me that it's just business. And as for courts, I handed him another document. This is a preliminary injunction, freezing all the assets of the Sterling Fund. Your approval of that cash injection to bail out Julian's company would have been a breach of your fiduciary duty to the fund's investors, a duty I, as a newly reinstated minority interest holder, thanks to a very interesting clause I found in the original articles of incorporation, have a responsibility to report. The Financial Conduct Authority will be visiting your office at 10 a.m. The color drained from his face. He understood instantly. They weren't just losing a house, they were losing everything: their fund, their reputations, their freedom. The aggressive debt-fueled empire they built was collapsing under its own weight, and I had simply given it the gentlest of pushes. I turned back to Julian. He was crying, silent tears of sheer shock rolling down his cheeks. There was no satisfaction in seeing it, no victory. It was just a result, a consequence. The keys, Julian, I said, holding out my hand. The party inside was to celebrate the sale of the company, my company, the one I'd poured my life into building with them. They called me a partner. But on paper I was just a salaried employee with a fancy title. I was naive. I trusted their handshakes. And their smiles. I believed them. When they said the paperwork was a formality, that we were in this together tonight was supposed to be my night too. We were going to announce my official partnership, my share of the buyout. The uncle had died a few years back. He had no children, no will that anyone could find. His estate had never been formally probated. The debt technically was still owed to his estate. And who has the right to act on behalf of a dormant estate? Anyone who can establish an interest, a creditor, or, I realized with a jolt, the successor to the creditor. He fumbled in his pocket and dropped them into my palm. They were cold. I closed my fingers around them. I suggest you pack efficiently, I said, and then I turned and walked past them up the driveway and into the house. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing in the vast empty hallway. I stood there for a moment in the silence. It wasn't about the house. I didn't want to live here. It was about the principle. It was about demonstrating, in the most concrete terms possible, that the quiet man in the corner, the one who checks the numbers, is not the one you ever want to corner, because while you're laughing and celebrating your short-term win, he's already 3 moves ahead, and he's playing for keeps. I walked over to the large floor-dosiling window and looked out at the view of the heath. The rain had cleared, and the morning sun was breaking through the clouds. It was just an asset, and I was just its temporary custodian. The real value was in the lesson, and I had a feeling they had finally learned it. The rain was a physical thing. It wasn't just water falling from the sky, it was a punishment. Each drop felt like a needle of ice, driven into my skin by a wind that howled with a kind of personal malice. I was huddled against the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one with the gnarled branches that looked like claws reaching for the house, their house. The windows were blazing with golden light, and I could see their shadows moving behind the glass. Laughing, I saw my cousin David raise a glass, and the others cheer. Were warm, they were dry, and I was out here shivering so hard, I thought my bones would splinter. They dragged me out here after the argument. It wasn't even a real argument. It was me finally, after a lifetime of their condescension and cruelty, telling them what I thought, telling David that he'd stolen the inheritance our grandfather meant for me, that he'd twisted the old man's mind in his final days. He hadn't even denied it. He just smiled, that thin, cruel smile of his, and said, "You've always had an active imagination, now get out of my house." And his friends, my so-called family, had picked me up and carried me out, tossing me onto the gravel driveway like a bag of trash. The slam of the front door was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. My teeth were chattering. I couldn't feel my fingers or my toes. The cold was sinking deep into my organs, into my soul. This was it. This was how I would die, not with dignity, but on my knees, in the mud, discarded by the people who were supposed to care. A raw animal sound tore from my throat, a sob mixed with pure rage. I looked up at the black churning sky, the rain stinging my eyes. I didn't pray to God. What God would listen to a scene like this? No. I screamed at the storm itself, at the ancient, indifferent force of the land. Please. I cried out my voice, ragged please, if you're out there, if anything is out there, I don't want to die, I want justice, I want what's mine, I want them to feel this. I want them to know what it's like to have everything ripped away. I was babbling delirious. But the words felt true. They felt like the only true thing left in the world. Ill. Give you anything, take. Memory, take my chance at ever being happy again, take. Whatever you want, just don't let them win, please. I found a lawyer, not a big flashy firm, but a small, sharp, relentless woman named Ms. Irwin, who specialized in property law. I laid it all out for her. She listened, her eyes narrowing. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, this is highly unusual. But the chain of title, it's messy. But it might just be messy enough to work. She explained the process. We would need to petition the court to be appointed as the administrator of the uncle's estate, based on our claim as a successor. As soon as the words left my mouth, the wind died. It didn't taper off, it just stopped as if a switch had been flipped. The pounding rain softened to a gentle patter. And then to nothing, a sliver of moon broke through the thinning clouds, casting a sickly silver light over the soaked lawn. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the storm had been. My breath caught in my throat. Something had listened. That's when I saw her, a woman standing between me and the tree. I hadn't seen her arrive, she was just there. She was tall and pale, her hair like strands of moss. And her dress, the color of wet stone. She didn't look solid, she looked like she was made of the mist rising from the ground. Her eyes were dark, deep pools that held no reflection. Your plea has been heard, she said. Her voice wasn't a sound that traveled through the air. It was a vibration inside my skull, cold and clear. You offer a token for a crown, a future joy, for a present victory. Are you certain? I didn't hesitate. There was no fear left in me, only a cold, hard certainty that had settled in the place where my fear had been. Yes, anything, just give me the house, give me what's mine. It is done, the spectral woman intoned. The property is bound to you not by paper and ink, but by blood and sorrow, by dawn. All within its walls will be yours to command. They will flee from the echoes of their own cruelty. But the house will be a cage as much as a kingdom. The walls will remember their laughter. The floors will hold the imprint of their feet. You will own every brick, and every brick will own a piece of you. This is the bargain. She didn't wait for my response. She simply faded, dissolving back into the mist from which she'd come. I was alone again. But I wasn't cold anymore. A strange warmth was spreading through my chest. I stood up, my muscles protesting, and walked toward the house. I didn't go inside. I found a bench on the porch shrouded in shadow, and I sat down to watch. It started quietly. Inside, a glass would shatter for no reason. A door would slam shut in a room where no one was standing. I saw David's wife, Clara, jump and clutch her chest when a portrait of their grandfather fell from the wall, the glass cracking over his stern face. They tried to laugh it off at first. Nerves. They said the storm had rattled us all. But it escalated. The whispers began. I couldn't hear them from where I sat, but I could see the effect. People would stop talking, their heads tilting, as if trying to catch a distant voice. Their faces would go pale. They'd look around, accusing each other of speaking. But no one had. The whispers were just for them, personal things, old secrets, regrets, shames, things only they would know. I saw my Aunt Margaret, who had always been so prim and proper, suddenly clap her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking her head, saying, no, no, stop it. I didn't mean to. Before she ran from the room, the festive mood was gone, replaced by a thick, creeping dread. Then the dreams came. They must have decided to try and sleep it off, to wait until morning. But that was a mistake. One by one I heard the screams, first from the guest room, then from David and Clara's bedroom. Upstairs, a shrill panic sound that cut through the quiet night. David came stumbling down the main staircase, his face ashen. It's in the room, he yelled, to no one in particular. It was standing in the corner, just watching me. He was a grown man, trembling in his pajamas. Creditor, once we controlled the estate, we could call the loan due, since it was already years past due. We could then execute the clause and foreclose on the property, transferring the deed to the estate, which we would then control. They all gathered in the living room, a frightened huddle under the very lights that had seemed so cheerful hours before. Now the light was harsh, exposing the fear on their faces. They were arguing, their voices shrill. They wanted to leave right then. But Clara was crying, saying the car keys were missing. David was insisting they were cursed, that grandfather's ghost was punishing them for what they did to me. The irony was so perfect, it was almost beautiful. They were doing the work for me. Their own guilt was the weapon. I just watched from the window. I saw them become prisoners in the home they'd stolen. Every shadow was a threat, every creak of the old house was a footstep. They were jumping at nothing, seeing things in the patterns of the wallpaper. The house was turning their own minds against them. It was a haunting. But not by a ghost, it was a haunting by consequence. As the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, they broke. They couldn't take it anymore. David Wilde'd grabbed a fireplace poker and smashed a window in the back door. They didn't bother with bags or coats. They just fled, scrambling out into the damp dawn, running down the driveway, without a backward glance. They left everything behind. The doors swung open. The house was empty. I waited until the sun was fully up, a cold, hard disk in a pale sky. I walked to the front door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a place that has been violently abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of stale wine and fear. There were half-empty glasses everywhere, chairs knocked over, evidence of their panic. I walked through the rooms. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. This was all mine now, every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, the very roof over my head I had won. I ran my hand along the mantelpiece where the fallen portrait had hung. The wood was smooth and cold. I had what I wanted. I had my revenge. But as I stood there in the hollow quiet, a profound emptiness opened up inside me. The warmth I'd felt from the bargain was gone, replaced by a deep, permanent chill. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a trophy won in a battle that had cost me my soul. The walls seemed to press in on me. I could still feel their presence, their panic etched into the atmosphere. This wasn't a victory celebration, it was a vigil. I went to the large window in the living room and looked out at the land that was now technically mine. The sun was rising. But it brought no warmth. I had gained the world I thought I wanted. I had my justice. But as I stood there utterly alone in the profound silence, I wondered what I had actually lost. The entity had warned me. The house was a cage. And I was now both the warden and the prisoner. I had got everything I asked for, and nothing that I needed. The rain wasn't just rain that night, it was a cold, driving needle storm, and every drop felt personal. I stood there on the pavement, soaked to the bone, staring up at the house, my house. At least it felt like mine. I'd designed every system in it, wired every connection, built the network from the ground up. And now it was a fortress, and I was locked outside. The light from the bay window was a warm golden square against the wet darkness, and I could see them moving around inside, laughing. They were definitely laughing. Then my phone buzzed in my soaked pocket, a notification from the home security app I'd built. Front door camera motion detected. I looked up. The camera's little red light was on, staring down at me like a cyclops. And then her voice came through the intercom speaker, crisp and clear, cutting through the hiss of the rain. It was a long shot, it was complicated, but it was perfectly, beautifully legal. "You look a little damp out there." It was Sarah. Her voice had that tone, that smug, syrupy sweetness she used when she knew she'd won. "The system says an unrecognized figure is loitering on the property. You should probably move along before it escalates to a police alert." I could hear Mark laughing in the background. "Yeah, mate," he chimed in, his voice closer to the mic. "Now, the forecast says it's going to pour all night. You might want to find a bus shelter or something." My own creation was mocking me. The door locks, which I'd programmed to recognize my fingerprint, were now dead to me. The biometric scanner just flashed a dull red. When I pressed my thumb against it, they'd changed the master codes, they'd revoked my access. This was my payment for 2 years of work, a lockout, a final humiliating dismissal, after they'd decided my contributions to their precious smartphone venture were, what was the term they used, no longer aligned with the company's direction, a fancy way of saying they'd taken my code and my ideas and didn't want to share the profits. I stood there for another minute, the water dripping from my hair down my neck. The cold was starting to seep into my bones, and that's when the anger stopped being a hot rush and started to become something else, something cold and hard and precise, an idea, a plan. I turned my back on the warm, mocking light and walked down the street. I didn't look for a bus shelter. I went to the all-night diner 3 blocks over, the one with the weak coffee and the free unsecured Wi-Fi. I found a booth in the back, ordered a coffee. I had no intention of drinking, and opened my laptop. The casing was still damp. The first step was getting back on the network. Their network. I'd built it with a centralized hub, a single powerful server, in the basement that managed everything: security, climate, entertainment, even the smart blinds. It was elegant, efficient, and it was a single point of failure, a vulnerability I'd always been aware of, but never thought I'd need to exploit. They'd changed the main admin passwords, of course, but they'd forgotten about the legacy protocols during the initial setup. Id created a low-level maintenance channel, a backdoor for diagnostics. It was buried under layers of code, invisible to the standard user interface. Id joked it was my ghost in the machine. Now it was my skeleton key. I wrote a script, a simple packet of data, that would ping that old port asking for a handshake. The server responded. It was like a door cracking open just an inch from there. It was a matter of escalation. I used an exploit in the voice control protocol, a buffer overflow vulnerability Id identified, and patched in the latest update. They in their arrogance hadn't bothered to install, yet their system was still running my old code with my old weaknesses. I gained user-level access, then administrator privileges, and just like that I was in the heart of the house, was now beating in my terminal window. Lines of code scrolled past a digital blueprint of the very home that had shut me out. The next few months were a study in quiet tension. I got a job waiting tables, living frugally, saving every penny to pay Ms. Irwin. We filed the petitions, we notified the Crofts. At first they laughed, their lawyer sent dismissive letters, calling our claim frivolous. They thought it was a pathetic attempt at extortion. They were so confident, so utterly sure of their position. They produced a cancelled check, from 8 years ago, made out to the uncle for the loan amount. See, they said it's paid. I started small, I didn't want to alert them, not yet. I adjusted the thermostat, I nudged it down by 1 degree, then another. A few minutes later, I saw the command come through from the living room table. Somion trying to set it back to 72. I overrode it, I dropped it to 68. Then 65. I could almost feel the chill settling into the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Next, the lights, I started turning them off room by room, not all at once, that would be too obvious. I'd kill the lights in the hallway. A minute later, the kitchen would go dark. Then the porch light, I turned the stereo on in the empty guest bedroom, playing a low ambient drone at a volume, just too quiet to place. I flushed the toilets. Repeatedly, the ghost in the machine was having fun. I could see it all on my screen, the motion sensors showed them moving from room to room. Confused, I accessed the internal cameras. The feed was grainy. But I could see Mark getting up, checking the thermostat, tapping the screen frustratedly. Sarah was on her phone, probably checking the app. I smiled. Their app was talking to my server. Now, it was telling them everything was fine. It was lying to them. Now for the main event. The locks were trivial. I own the server, so I own the doors. I set them to a new master code, my code. But that was just the physical space. I wanted the foundation. I wanted the I knew they used a digital vault service for their important documents, tax returns, contracts, the property title. They were proud of how paperless they were, that vanity was their undoing. The vault was protected by a password, but it was linked to their primary email, which was linked to the home's network, a network I now controlled. I initiated a password reset on the vault service. The reset link was sent to their email. I intercepted it before their devices could even ping. I clicked the link from my own machine, set a new password, and was inside their digital life within seconds. There it was, a PDF file named Property Deed 118 Crestview Drive. I downloaded it. I also found their banking login credentials, saved in a file marked Utilities Perfect. The property registry for the county had moved to a blockchain-based system last year. It was supposed to be more secure, more transparent. And it was, but it was also just a system. And every system has a workflow. It required a digitally signed transfer document and a verification payment from a registered bank account. I had the document, I had their bank account details. I used a graphic design tool to create a flawless copy of their digital signatures. It wasn't a forgery in the traditional sense. It was a perfect digital replica, indistinguishable from the real thing. I uploaded the deed, attached the signatures, and initiated the transfer. The system asked for the verification payment. I authorized it, routing the small fee from their own checking account. The transaction processed. The blockchain updated a new entry, was logged. The owner of 118 Crestview Drive was now me. But Ms. Irwin was ready. A cancelled check is not a lien release, she wrote back. The security instrument remains on the title. The debt in the eyes of the property record is still live until you formally discharge it. You didn't. Your oversight, your problem. It was 4:17 in the morning. The rain had finally stopped. The transfer was complete, irreversible. I owned the house, I owned the network, I owned every light bulb, every lock, every appliance inside it. I closed my laptop, left a $5 bill under the coffee cup, and walked out of the diner. The air was clean and cold. The world was quiet. I walked back to Crestview Drive, my shoes splashing in the leftover puddles. The sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep bruised blue. I stood at the foot of the driveway again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked right up to the front door. I didn't press my thumb to the scanner. I just stood there. The camera saw me. The system recognized the new owner. There was a soft, almost inaudible whirring sound. As the deadbolt retracted, the door clicked open an inch. Inside it was silent. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards cool under my wet shoes. I went straight to the control panel. In the study, the main touchscreen interface, I logged in with my new master credentials. The entire house schematic glowed on the screen, green and compliant. I selected whole home audio and chose the master bedroom speakers. I typed a simple message. Then I turned the volume to maximum and pressed play. The silence was shattered by a blaring robotic voice that echoed through the halls. Attention, the owner of the property has changed. You have 10 minutes to vacate the premises. I watched on the camera feed. The bedroom door flew open. Mark and Sarah stumbled out, bleary-eyed and terrified. They were frantically tapping at their phones. But Id already bricked them. Id sent a remote command that rendered them useless little black slabs of glass and metal. The lights in the hallway snapped on blindingly bright. I set the alarm to a continuous low whoop, not a panic alarm, just a persistent, annoying reminder that their time was up. They scrambled, pulling on coats over their pajamas, grabbing car keys. They looked like ghosts. Pale and confused, Sarah tried to open the front door, but it was still locked from my panel. I disengaged the lock. The door swung open. They didn't even look back. They ran out into the dawn, got into their car, and sped off down the street. The silence returned. I turned off the alarm. I turned the lights back to a soft, warm glow. I opened the smart blinds in the living room, revealing the sunrise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I cranked the thermostat back to a comfortable 72 degrees. I walked through the rooms, my rooms. The house was quiet, but it was no longer silent. It was waiting. It was listening. I went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, smart fridge of coursing, took out a bottle of water. I stood by the large window looking out at the wet, gleaming street. I took a long drink. The water was cold and perfect. The court battles were slow and procedural. The Crofts fought every step. But their arrogance was their downfall. They underestimated us. They thought they could bully us into going away. But we had the law on our side, a very specific, very obscure point of property law. Finally, after months, a judge ruled in our favor. We were granted administration of the estate the next day. We sent a formal demand for payment of the loan plus 8 years of compounded interest, a sum that was now significant. They had 30. I was no longer outside in the rain. I was inside. And the house, every wire, every sensor, every line of code knew it. It was all mine, not just the structure, but the very idea of it. The security, the comfort, the control. I had taken it all back. The ghost was no longer in the machine. The ghost was now the master of the machine. And the domain was finally completely silent for me. Days to pay. They didn't. They were too proud, too furious. They thought it was a bluff. They filed countersuits, appeals, anything to tie us up. But they missed the 30-day deadline. The moment it passed, Ms. Irwin executed the foreclosure clause. The transfer of the property deed to the estate was recorded at the county clerk's office at 4:58 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was done. I was now the legal owner of their house. The next morning was bright and clear. The storm from months ago was a distant memory. The sky was a sharp, cloudless blue. I put on the only good suit I owned. Ms. Irwin met me at the end of the driveway. She handed me a set of documents, the recorded deed, the eviction notice. She said she would handle the formalities, but I asked to do this part myself. Instead, around 9 o'clock, David Croft had called me into his study. His brother Mark was there leaning against the desk. They weren't smiling anymore. David got straight to the point. He said the new buyers only wanted the principals. They said my position was redundant. They said a lot of things, all of them polite and legal sounding. But the message was clear. I was being cut out. After 10 years, I was nothing, a liability to be disposed of. We walked up the driveway together. The house looked different in the sunlight. It looked like what it was mine. I saw David through the kitchen window, holding a coffee mug. He saw me. His expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror. He disappeared from the window. And a moment later the front door flew open. He and Mark both stood there still in their robes. "What the hell are you doing here?" David snarled. "Call the police." "I don't think you will," I said, my voice calm and steady. I held up the folder. "This is a notice of eviction. You have 7 to 2 hours to remove your personal belongings from the premises." Mark laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You've lost your mind. Get off my property." "It's not your property," I said. I took out the top document, the deed, and held it so they could see their names being replaced by mine. "It's mine. The title was transferred yesterday. It's a matter of public record." The color drained from their faces. The confusion was absolute. They started talking over each other, sputtering about lawyers, about appeals, about how this was impossible. But the certainty in my eyes, the calm authority of Ms. Irwin standing slightly behind me, it began to sink in. This was real. The foundation of their world had just been pulled out from under them with a piece of paper. I looked from David's stunned silence to Mark's furious disbelief. I took a step forward toward the door they had locked against me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a key, a new key Id had made that morning. I held it up, letting the morning sun glint off the brass. "I'll be by on Friday afternoon to change the locks," I said. "I'd recommend you be gone by then." I turned and walked back down the driveway, leaving them standing in the doorway of the house that was no longer theirs. The sun was warm on my face. The air was clean and fresh. I didn't feel the burning rage of revenge anymore. I felt a profound, deep stillness, a sense of closure. They had left me outside in the rain, believing I was nothing. This morning I owned their house, and the door was forever open. The rain wasn't just falling, it was a judgment. Each drop felt like a small, cold verdict against me, against my very existence. In that family they had just closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place was sharper than any slap. It was final. I stood there on the paved driveway, watching the light from the kitchen window. A square of false gold in the drowning gray. I could see their silhouettes moving behind the glass, already resuming their lives, as if a piece of trash had just been neatly taken out to the. I argued, my voice rose. I reminded them of every promise, every late night, every idea Id brought to the table that was now part of the company's value. Mark just shook his head, a look of pity on his face that was more insulting than anger. David said I was being emotional, that I didn't understand the complexities of the deal. He said it would be better if I left. I refused. I said I wouldn't go quietly. Curb. The water soaked through my clothes in minutes. It was a cold that went straight to the bone. A deep, aching chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was the cold of expulsion. The rain poured off the roof in solid sheets, creating a curtain between me and the world. I thought I knew the world inside that house. The gutters couldn't handle it. Water overflowed, splattering onto the flower beds, with a sound like frantic applause. My hair was plastered to my forehead, and I had to keep wiping my eyes just to see, but there was nothing to see except the closed door. And that's when I noticed it. This wasn't normal rain. It had a weight to it, a thickness. It didn't just make things what it seemed to be, changing them. The colors of the world began to bleed. The vibrant green of the manicured lawn started to run like wet paint, seeping into the gravel and turning it a murky olive. The cheerful red of the front door began to soften, to dilute, losing its aggressive cheerfulness. It was as if the rain was washing away a layer of pretense, stripping the world back to its raw materials. My own despair began to feel like just another color, a dark purple bruise being washed out of my soul and into the swirling water around my feet. I tried to fight it. At first I huddled against the door, seeking some pathetic sliver of shelter from the overhang. But the wind shifted, blowing the rain sideways, and it found me anyway. It was relentless. My teeth were chattering, and my body shook with a violence that felt like it might break me apart. And then a strange thought occurred to me. What if I stopped fighting? What if I just let it happen? It was a moment of complete surrender. I stepped away from the door, away from the feeble protection of the house that had rejected me. I walked out into the center of the driveway, right into the heart of the downpour. I tilted my head back and let the rain hit my face full force. I stopped trying to wipe it away. I opened my mouth and drank it in. It tasted of metal and soil and something ancient. And a profound quiet settled over me. The sound of the rain, which had been a roar of anger, became a hum, a low resonant frequency that vibrated through the ground and up into the soles of my feet. The cold wasn't painful anymore. It was clarifying. It was washing away the grime of their words, the sticky residue of their pretended love. With every drop that hit me, I felt a layer of that old life sloughing off, the shame, the feeling of being less than the constant need to earn a place that was never truly offered. It all began to dissolve and flow away into the growing rivers on the pavement. I stood there, arms slightly out, and let the alchemy happen. The rain and my despair were merging, and from that mixture, something new was being born. I knew I couldn't stay in the open all night, but the house was not an option. It was still their house. My feet moved almost on their own, squelching through the sodden grass, leading me around to the back of the property. There, in the far corner, almost swallowed by overgrown ivy and a sprawling hydrangea bush, was the old garden shed. It was a forgotten place, used to store broken lawn furniture and dusty flower pots. The door was warped, but it yielded with a groan when I pushed. That's when they physically escorted me out, Mark on one arm, David on the other. They weren't rough, but they were firm. The other guests in the living room pretended not to see. I saw a few looks of embarrassment, but no one said a word. They opened the front door, and the sound of the rain roared into the elegant hallway. They pushed me out onto the porch, and then Mark came out and gave me one final shove that sent me stumbling down the steps onto the wet driveway. The door closed behind him. I heard the inside was dark and smelled of damp wood and earth. It was cluttered, but it was dry, mostly dry. A few drops found their way through a crack in the roof, plinking into a rusty watering can. I sat on an overturned crate, pulling my knees to my chest. The sound of the rain on the tin roof was different in here. It was a drumming, a rhythm. It wasn't just water anymore, it was a language. I listened. It spoke of the land. It told me stories of what was here before the house was built. A wide open field, a grove of oak trees, a small creek that ran where the sewer pipe now lay buried. It whispered about the foundations of the house itself, how they were poured over a place that had been sacred to others long ago. The rain was a memory washing the present away to reveal the past. It showed me that my connection to this place had nothing to do with the people who lived in the house. They were just temporary occupants, renters. The rain was telling me that I belonged to the land, and in turn, it belonged to me. It was a truth that went deeper than any deed. Exhaustion eventually pulled me under into a fitful sleep, or maybe it was more than sleep. It was a vision. I was standing in the backyard, but it was different. The manicured lawn was gone, replaced by wild grasses and flowers. The house was there, but it was smaller, simpler, and it glowed with a soft, welcoming light. A figure stood by the back door, an old woman with kind eyes. She didn't speak, but she smiled at me and gestured for me to come inside. She pointed to the ground at my feet, and I saw roots thick and strong reaching down from me into the soil, connecting me to the earth. She nodded, as if confirming something I already knew in my heart. Then she faded, and I was looking at the house as it was now, but I saw it with new eyes. I saw its soul, and I knew with a certainty that shook me awake that its soul recognized mine. The rain stopped just before dawn. The silence that followed was immense. A held breath. I pushed open the shed door and stepped out into a world reborn. Everything sparkled. Each blade of grass was jeweled with 1,000 tiny rainbows. The air was so clean it felt like drinking light. The world was washed clean, and so was I. I felt new, solid. The trembling uncertainty of the night before was gone. In its place was a deep, resonant calm. I walked toward the house, but I wasn't walking toward their house anymore. I was walking toward my home. My feet knew the way. The gravel of the path didn't shift uncomfortably under my shoes. It felt firm, supportive. I reached the iron gate that led to the backyard patio. It was always stiff, usually requiring a shove with a shoulder to open. This morning, I simply reached out my hand. My fingers didn't even touch the latch. As my palm neared the cold metal, I felt a click, not in the lock, but in the air itself. The gate swung inward, silent and smooth, welcoming me. I walked across the patio stones, still dark with rain. I placed my hand flat against the back door of the house. The wood was cool and damp, but beneath that I felt a warmth, a pulse. It was a heartbeat. The house was sleeping, but it knew I was there. It was waiting for me to come home. That's when the kitchen door opened. It was him, my uncle. He stood there, bleary-eyed, holding a coffee mug. He looked confused. Then his face hardened into its familiar mask of irritation. "What are you doing back here? I thought you'd have had the sense to find a bus station by now." Distinct click of the lock turning. He stepped outside, but he hesitated on the threshold. He looked around, as if sensing the change in the atmosphere, but not understanding it. The air felt charged, different. The light seemed to cling to me, to highlight me, while he remained in the shadow of the doorway. "I live here," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. It carried on the new morning air with a strange weight. He snorted. "Don't be ridiculous. You have nowhere to go, that's the whole point, now get off my property, before I call the police. I didn't move. I looked past him into the kitchen. I looked at the tiles on the floor, the pattern I knew so well. I looked at the stove, where Id burned countless pieces of toast. I looked at the table, where Id sat silent for so many meals. And I knew every inch of it. I knew it deeper than he ever could. This isn't your property, I said. And it wasn't an argument, it was a simple statement of fact, like saying the sky is blue. It never was. Not really, you just lived here, the house knows the difference. He stared at me, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. What are you talking about? The deed is in my name, the law. The law of this house is older than your paperwork. I interrupted, my voice still calm. It belongs to whoever it chooses, and it has chosen me. As if on cue, a strange thing happened. The kitchen light above his head flickered once, twice, and then went out. Not a power cut. The clock on the microwave was still glowing. Just that one light. A shadow fell over him. Then from inside, we heard a loud crack. He spun around. A large cabinet door, one that had always been stubborn, had swung completely open, its contents a jumble of vases and serving platters threatening to spill out. The house was stirring, it was making its opinion. He took a step back, looking from the cabinet to me. His confidence was crumbling. He was starting to feel what I knew. He was the outsider here. He was the guest who had overstayed his welcome. I walked toward the door. He moved aside without a word or reflex. He didn't seem to control. I stepped across the threshold into my home. The air inside was different too. It was no longer stale with resentment and quiet anger. It was fresh, as if all the windows had been thrown open during the storm. The house seemed to sigh around me, a sound of settling, of contentment. It felt right. I knelt there in the mud, and the rain shivering uncontrollably. The cold was secondary to the heat of the humiliation, the sheer staggering force of the betrayal. The water ran down my face, mixing with tears. I couldn't hold back. I made a sound, a choked, guttural thing that was swallowed by the storm. I vowed right there, with the gravel cutting into my skin, that this would not be the end. This rage, this cold hard knot forming in my chest, would be my fuel. They thought they could discard me like trash. They had no idea what they had. I heard footsteps on the stairs. My aunt appeared, her face pale. What's going on? What was that noise? She saw me standing there dripping onto the mat, and her mouth fell open. My uncle found his voice again, but it was weaker now. She's delusional, talking nonsense about the house choosing her. I turned to look at them, these two people who had thought they could discard me. I felt no anger, only a vast, quiet certainty. You should probably start packing. I said the house would like you to leave. And as I said it, a final undeniable event occurred. The front door, the one they had locked against me, swung open, with a long, slow creak. Sunshine flooded the hallway. It was an invitation for them to exit, a clear, unambiguous message from the house itself. They looked at the open door, then at me, standing perfectly at ease in the heart of the home they believed was theirs. The illusion was shattered. They saw the truth that the rain had revealed. They were just visitors, and their time was up. The rain was never just rain, it was a judgment. Each drop was a tiny cold verdict against me. And you were all inside, where it was warm and dry. I could see the golden squares of the windows, the blurred shapes of you moving behind the glass, laughing. Probably. I stood out there for an hour, maybe more. The water soaked through my coat, my shirt, right down to my skin. It felt like a baptism into a new kind of understanding, a clarity. You thought it was just a simple thing, didn't you, forgetting to invite me in a small oversight? But in that moment, under that relentless icy water, I saw the entire architecture of our relationship, the lies, the condescension, the way you'd always treated me like an afterthought. The house itself seemed to be watching me, its dark windows like indifferent eyes. That was the moment I decided, if you wouldn't let me in, I would simply have to own the door. It started as a quiet thought, a seed planted in the mud of that humiliation. The house, it should have been mine, you know, long before you ever laid eyes on it. There's a history here you've never bothered to learn. My great-grandfather supposedly planted the oak in the backyard. My mother told me stories about playing in the attic when she was a girl, when her aunt lived here. You see, the roots of my claim go deep, much deeper than your mortgage paperwork. You just bought it, you paid money, but connection, true ownership. That's a matter of spirit, of blood. I began to see my plan not as a theft, but as a reclamation, a correcting of a historical wrong. Every time I walked past, I'd notice something new, a loose tile on the roof, a crack in the garden wall, signs of your neglect, proof that you were merely caretakers, and poor ones at that. I began to document everything, not in a notebook, but in my mind, a catalog of your failures. This was the foundation I would build on. The first step was the easiest. I needed to get inside to feel the space when you weren't there. I knew about the spare key you thought was so clever tucked under the false rock near the lavender bush. It was simple one Tuesday afternoon. When you were both at work, I let myself in. The silence was profound. It was different from the silence of my own apartment. This was a waiting silence, a respectful one. I took off my shoes at the door, a sign of respect for what would soon be wholly mine. I walked through the rooms not as a guest but as a curator. I touched the walls. I ran my fingers along the mantelpiece. I stood in the center of your living room and closed my eyes, and I could feel the house acknowledging me. It knew I belonged. I did a few small things. I moved a photograph on the hallway table, just a fraction of an inch. I turned a book on your shelf, so its spine was facing inward. Tiny, imperceptible adjustments, the first gentle nudges to make you question your own memory. Just awakened. The gaslighting, that's what they call it, isn't it? It's such a clinical term for such delicate work. It's more like gardening. You plant a seed of doubt, and you water it patiently. I started with the wife. You were always the more impressionable one. I saw you in the grocery store. I made a point of bumping into you. I said quite casually, "Oh, hello. I was just thinking about your house. It's so wonderful how well you've maintained the original molding in the front room. So many people would have torn that out." You looked confused. You started to say something about how there wasn't any special molding, but I just smiled warmly and said, "Oh, around the doorway, the intricate scrollwork, it's a signature of houses from that era." But of course I walked away, leaving you standing there, probably wondering if you'd ever really looked at your own front. The next time it was your husband. I saw him mowing the lawn. I leaned over the fence and said, the previous owner, old Mrs. Gable. She always said the south corner of the yard was a trouble spot for drainage. She had me help her install a French drain there one summer. Hopefully it's still holding up." He stared at me. He had no idea who Mrs. Gable was. Your realtor never mentioned her. But the certainty in my voice, it unsettled him. I could see it in his eyes, a little flicker of maybe. I started leaving things for you to find: a single old-fashioned key on a ring I left on your back porch. Step, a faded photograph I'd found at a flea market of a woman who vaguely resembled my supposed great-aunt, standing in front of a house that could from a certain angle be mistaken for yours. I tucked it into your mailbox. I wanted the evidence of my legacy to seep into your lives slowly like a stain. Then came the noises at night, of course, a soft tapping on your bedroom window, not enough to be alarming, just enough to wake you. You'd look out and see nothing but the dark. That was me. You understand, I have a very light touch. With a pebble I'd walk around the perimeter of the house. When the moon was bright, casting my shadow on your blinds, you started sleeping with the lights on. I could see it from the street. The glow of your fear. I'd stand under your window and just listen. I heard you arguing once. Your voice was and tight with stress. You were saying, "I feel like I am going crazy. Things are moving. I keep hearing things." And he said, "It's an old house, it settles." But he didn't sound convinced. He sounded scared. That was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The confrontation was inevitable. I engineered it perfectly. I waited for a night when there was a storm echo of that first night. You left me outside. The rain was lashing down. The wind was howling. I knew you'd be on edge. I didn't knock. I used my key. I just walked right into your living room. You were both on the sofa, and you jumped up like you'd seen a ghost. The television was on, casting blue light on your terrified faces. I stood there dripping onto your rug, perfectly calm. "I am sorry to intrude," I said, my voice even and soft, "but I needed to check on the leak in the attic. It always acts up in a storm like this." Your husband found his voice first. "What are you doing in our house? Get out." He took a step forward, but it was shaky. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. I didn't move. I just looked at him with a kind of pity. "Your house," I said. I let the words hang in the air. "This has never been your house. Not truly. You've been living in a fantasy. A temporary arrangement." I gestured around the room. "Do you even know why the floorboards in this corner squeak? It's because of the support beam my grandfather helped install after the '38 earthquake. Do you know what's buried under the rose bushes? By the fence. This is my history, my home. You've just been keeping it warm for me." I don't know how long I stayed there. Eventually, the cold became unbearable. I got up, my body aching, and trudged down the long driveway to the road. I walked for miles in the pouring rain, until I found a bus shelter. I had nothing. My phone was dead. My wallet was inside the house in the jacket it hung up so carefully, just an hour before they had taken everything. The wife started to cry, quiet, helpless sobs. "You're insane," your husband whispered. But there was no force behind it. It was a plea. "Am I?" I said. I reached into my pocket and took out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was nothing a fake deed I'd created on my computer and aged with tea stains. But I held it like a sacred text. The paperwork is complicated entailments, old family trusts, your realtor sold you a lie. But I am not here to fight you, I am here to claim what's mine. I think you both know on some level that I am right. You've felt it, haven't you? The house has never quite felt like yours. Because it isn't. I saw the moment it broke in him, the moment his reality shattered. He looked from me to his weeping wife, to the walls of the house that had suddenly become a prison. He was defeated. The psychological conquest was complete. I had not argued my way to ownership. I had simply asserted it, with such unwavering conviction, that I had rewritten the truth of the world for both of you. You left that night. You packed a few things while I sat in your armchair watching you. You couldn't get out fast enough. You didn't even call the police. What would you have said? That a neighbor was sitting in your living room, claiming it was hers. You knew how it would sound. You knew in the end that you had lost. You surrendered the property not to a court, but to my will. Now the morning is here. The rain has stopped. The sun is streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. This is my light. I am sitting in this chair in this living room. Your furniture is still here. Your smells are still here. But it's mine. Every board, every nail, every whisper in the pipes. It belongs to me. I can hear a car door slam outside, the sound of the neighborhood waking up. They have no idea what happened here last night. They'll see your moving van later and think you just decide. Leave. They'll see me tending the garden and assume I bought the place. But we know the truth, don't we? The real deed was written in the rain and signed in your fear. I own this house. I own every memory you tried to make here, and I will replace them with my own. This is victory. This is peace. This is home. The rain started as a light drizzle, just a few drops on my windshield, as I pulled up to the big house on Crestview Lane. By the time I had their package in my hand, it was a full-on downpour. I could hear it drumming on the roof of my van. A steady, heavy rhythm. I pulled my thin jacket collar up, but I knew it was useless. I was going to get soaked. I ran up the long paved driveway, the box held tight against my chest, trying to shield it as much as myself. The porch was wide and covered, a safe haven from the weather. I rang the doorbell and stepped back, waiting. I could see movement through the frosted glass of the front door. It swung open, and Mr. Henderson stood there, looking annoyed. His wife, Carol, was just behind him, in the massive foyer, arranging flowers in a vase, as if the storm outside wasn't happening. Package for Henderson, I said, holding it out. The wind whipped rain under the porch roof, stinging the side of my face. He took it with a grunt, barely glancing at me. About time. It was supposed to be here yesterday.